Under the fading light of the Arizona sky, the desert stretched wide and endless, painted in amber and rose. Wind rolled across the sand, carrying whispers from faraway canyons where coyotes called and memories hid. It was the kind of evening that made promises feel heavier, as if the land itself demanded truth from every word spoken upon it. She sat near the fire, her eyes fixed on the man across from her, a man who did not belong to her world, yet somehow felt written into her fate. His skin caught the light like bronze carved by the sun, his dark braids tied with leather, his silence deep as the mountains. He was Apache. She had been told to fear men like him. But fear was not what stirred inside her now. The girl had once known gentler landscapes, meadows by the river, white clapboard fences, the sound of church bells marking Sunday hours. Her father's ranch had been her whole world. And the man she was promised to was from that same world, a quiet, honorable man who owned land and spoke of family. She had promised him her future, her purity, her word. But that was before the raid. Before the desert swallowed her, before the Apache warrior found her bleeding and lost beneath the cruel sun. When he lifted her that day, his arms were strong, his touch steady, his eyes unreadable. She had tried to speak, but her throat was dry from fear and dust. He gave her water, then silence. A silence that wrapped around her like safety, though she couldn't explain why. The other Apaches had looked at her with suspicion, but not him. He carried her to the camp, treated her wounds, and left without asking questions. She would later learn his name, though she could never say it right, not the way his people did. With that quiet reverence of air meeting stone, days turned to weeks. She should have hated the place, the harsh wind. The endless sand, the unfamiliar language murmured around smoky fires, yet somehow she found peace in the rhythm of it. The people watched her but did not harm her. The women taught her small things, how to grind herbs, how to weave the soft reeds by the river. Sometimes she caught herself smiling when the children laughed near the horses, or when the warrior returned from hunting with dust on his arms and a rare softness in his eyes. But she did not forget the promise she had made, the one that bound her to another man. She told herself that her heart belonged to her past, that this life was only borrowed time until she could return home. Yet every time the Apache spoke her name, every time his hand brushed against hers, the promise felt weaker. That evening, when she cut her foot on a sharp stone near the river, he found her before she could cry out. He knelt beside her without a word, his brow furrowed as he cleaned the wound with the gentleness of a man who understood pain too well. The fading light painted their faces gold. She watched his hands move, careful and strong, and for the first time, she saw him not as her captor or savior, but as something else entirely. "You should not walk alone," he said in slow, broken English. His voice was deep, quiet, like the echo of distant thunder. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, though she didn't know if he understood. He looked up, his eyes holding hers longer than they should have. For a moment, the world fell silent, only the breath of wind between them. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fire outside flickered against the walls of the small shelter they had given her. She thought of her home, of the man she had promised herself to, and tried to recall the warmth in his eyes, the safety of his voice. But instead, she saw the Apache's face, the steady care in his touch, the strength in his silence. She hated herself for it. She prayed for forgiveness. But her heart had begun to beat in a rhythm that didn't belong to her old life anymore. The next day, she saw him speaking with the elders. They stood beneath a red cliff, the sun turning their shadows long and sharp. His voice was low but firm, his gestures deliberate. The others listened. When he looked her way, she turned quickly, pretending to sort the herbs she had gathered. Yet she could feel his gaze, not heavy, not claiming, but knowing, by the third moon. She had begun to understand pieces of their language, enough to learn that there was talk of returning her to the nearest settlement when the trading season came. The thought should have filled her with relief. Instead, her chest ached with confusion. One evening, when the wind rose and carried sand through the valley, she found herself standing by the fire again. He was there, sharpening his knife with slow, careful strokes. She hesitated, then sat across from him. The silence between them was no longer strange. It was full like a river just before it floods. "You will go soon," he said, without looking up. "Yes," she answered. The word trembled. "That is what your people said." He nodded, the motion tight. "You want that?" She looked down at her hands. "I should, but your heart?" He asked quietly. The question hit her like an arrow she didn't see coming. She looked up, startled. The firelight flickered between them, making his eyes seem endless. "My heart doesn't know what it wants anymore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He set the knife aside. "Then do not promise it yet." She turned away before he could see the tears building in her eyes. That night rain came, rare, wild, and sudden. The sky cracked open, and the earth drank deeply. She stepped outside, feeling the cool drops against her skin. The Apache stood in the distance, his hair soaked, his face turned to the storm. It struck her then how small her world had been before him, how easily it could vanish under the weight of one heartbeat. She wasn't supposed to feel in the days that followed. Her thoughts tangled between duty and desire. The memory of her promise burned like a brand, yet her heart betrayed her with every glance, every word shared in quiet. She told herself she could control it, that it was gratitude, not love. But when he reached for her hand as they crossed the river one morning, her resolve broke. Neither spoke. The touch lingered longer than it should have, and something unspoken passed between them, something she couldn't name. The moment ended when they saw smoke rising from the hills. A scouting party from the white settlement was nearby. The Apache's eyes hardened, and he told her to stay hidden. But she followed him instead, unable to let him go into danger alone. From the ridge, she saw the riders' men from her world, guns slung across their saddles. They were coming closer. Her heart pounded. She knew what would happen if they saw her with him. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "They come for you," he said. "You must choose." Her breath caught. "Choose." He nodded. "Your world or mine?" Lightning split the sky above them, painting the mountains white for a heartbeat. She stood frozen, torn between the promise she had made and the truth she could no longer deny. And before she could speak, he stepped forward into the storm, into the danger, his figure swallowed by rain, and freely. She called his name, but the wind carried it away. And in that moment, she realized something that would haunt her forever. She had promised her body to another. But the Apache had claimed her heart first. The sound of thunder rolled through the canyon. And the story of her choice was just beginning. Rain fell hard through the night, washing away tracks and blood alike. By morning, the sky was still heavy with gray, and the valley carried the scent of smoke and fear. She sat by the dying fire, her hands trembling as she stared toward the ridge where he had vanished. The Apache had gone to face the riders alone, leaving her with nothing but silence and the echo of his last words. She told herself he would return, he always did, but the hours stretched long, and every whisper of wind felt like a warning. When he finally came back, the sun was low again. His shoulders were wet with rain, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion, but his eyes were alive, sharp with something she couldn't name. He walked past her without speaking, dropped his bow near the fire, and sat down. Only then did she see the blood on his arm. "You're hurt," she said, moving closer. He shook his head. "Not mine," she hesitated. "Then whose?" He didn't answer right away. The fire popped between them. "Men from your settlement," he said quietly. They were near the river. They saw tracks, but the storm took them. Her breath caught. "They were looking for me?" He nodded. "They think you dead. They will not stop." She lowered her eyes. The thought of being found, of being taken back, should have brought relief. But all she felt was fear. "If they find me here, they will bring war," he said simply. The word hung heavy in the air. War. It wasn't new to this land. The scars of it marked every ridge and shadow. Yet now it felt closer, like something breathing just beyond the fearish. In the days that followed, the camp grew restless. The elders spoke in low voices, glancing toward her with uncertain eyes. The women who had once shared their food with her now avoided her gaze. She tried to help where she could, fetching water, tending to the horses, grinding corn beside the older women, but the unease never lifted. One evening, she found the Apache sitting alone by the cliffs, watching the horizon. His bow rested across his knees. She stood beside him, unsure whether to speak. "Your people are afraid of me," she said at last. "They are afraid for you," he replied. She frowned. "What do you mean?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, but words failed her. He turned to leave, but she caught his hand. For a heartbeat, neither moved. "Don't go," she whispered. He looked at her hand gripping his, then at her face. "You said you were promised to another," he said softly. Her voice broke. "I was." Before I knew what love could feel like, his expression faltered, pain flickering behind his eyes. "Your world and mine are not the same." "Maybe not," she said, "but my heart doesn't care." The wind swept through the valley, carrying dust and sorrow. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. He pulled his hand free gently, his gaze steady and full of things left unsaid. That night she couldn't eat. The camp was restless again, preparing to move. She heard talk of scouts, of white riders coming through the hills. Every sound made her flinch, but worse than the fear was the thought of leaving him behind. When dawn came, the women packed her belongings. She didn't speak. The Apache wasn't there. She searched the camp, the cliffs, the river, nothing. Only footprints fading into the red dust. The elder woman who had shown her kindness placed a hand on her shoulder and said something she half understood, that some paths must separate, so others can survive. But as the sun climbed, and the valley stretched before her one last time, she knew she would not survive this parting. Somewhere beyond those mountains, the man she had promised herself to was waiting, the one who believed she was still his. But her heart no longer beat for that world. It belonged to the wild silence, to the wind, to the man who had risked everything for her, and though she walked away, she could still feel him watching from the cliffs. Unseen but near, a ghost of love that would not fade with distance. The land was changing. The war was coming, and she carried both their hearts into the unknown, caught between two worlds that could never meet without breaking her completely. The trail rose in a line of red switchbacks, cutting across the ribs of the mountains. She climbed with the small group at dawn, led by 2 scouts and the elder woman who kept close to her side. The pack horses snorted white breaths in the chill. The camp had sent them out in silence, as if the morning itself knew not to speak. Behind them, smoke from cook fires thinned into the pale sky. She did not look back. She feared that if she did, her feet would turn around and carry her to the cliffs where he might be watching. By mid-morning, they reached a saddle, where wind combed the grass flat and the world opened in every direction. To the east spread a hard, bright plain. To the west lay a chain of blue ridges that looked like the backs of sleeping animals. The elder touched her arm and pointed toward the north. There, tucked into the folds of rock, a narrow valley cut away from the main pass. "A safe path," the elder said in a mix of words and gestures. Hunters used it when storms crowded the higher trail. It would hide them from riders coming from the settlement. They started down the side path. Loose stones rolled underfoot. She kept her head low, yet her thoughts ran ahead to the man who had stayed behind and to the other life waiting somewhere near the river towns. The promise stood in her mind like a fence post set deep in clay. She could not pull it free, yet it no longer marked the border it once had. The wind brought the scent of pine and damp earth, and with it came the memory of his hand closing around hers in the river. Steady and warm. Near noon, the scouts halted. The younger one knelt and pressed his ear to the ground. He pointed at a patch of dust and held up 2 fingers. Horses, not far. The elder drew them off the trail into a stand of juniper. They waited without a word. The click of beetles sounded loud. She counted breaths to keep from shaking. At last the riders passed on the main trail above them, 4 men in hats pulled low. She caught a flash of a blue coat. Soldiers or men who liked to be taken for soldiers. Her throat went dry. When the riders were gone, they moved again, slower and lower under the trees. The elder glanced at her from time to time with a look that was not unkind, only heavy with the strain of keeping a secret alive. By evening, they reached a narrow basin that held a green spring and a circle of cottonwoods. They made a small fire that gave more smoke than flame. The elder set a pot to heat, then cut willow sticks into thin strips and soaked them. Her fingers were quick and sure. She worked a weave that would become a small basket by morning, something for the girl to carry at the next day's start. It felt like a gift and a lesson at once. Under the trees, she tried to sleep. But the night made room for worries to lie down beside her. She wondered what the riders had seen, wondered if the warrior had met them along some bend in the canyon. She told herself he was clever and quiet, the kind of man the land itself might help. Still, her hands would not grow warm. By the second day, the path tightened into a slot, where walls rose straight as church pillars. The scouts moved like shadows, pausing to study faint signs on the ground. Now and then the elder touched the girl's sleeve and whispered a warning about loose rock or a thorn hidden in the brush. Near afternoon, they came upon the remains of a camp tucked under an overhang. Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, but words failed her. He turned to leave, but she caught his hand. For a heartbeat, neither moved. "Don't go," she whispered. He looked at her hand gripping his, then at her face. "You said you were promised to another," he said softly. Her voice broke. "I was, for I knew what love could feel like." His expression faltered, pain flickering behind his eyes. "Your world and mine are not the same." "Maybe not," she said. "But my heart doesn't care." The wind swept through the valley, carrying dust and sorrow. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. He pulled his hand free gently, his gaze steady and full of things left unsaid. That night, she couldn't eat. Camp was restless again, preparing to move. She heard talk of scouts, of white riders coming through the hills. Every sound made her flinch. But worse than the fear was the thought of leaving him behind. When dawn came, the women packed her belongings. She didn't speak. The Apache wasn't there. She searched the camp, the cliffs, the river, nothing. Only footprints fading into the red dust. The elder woman who had shown her kindness placed a hand on her shoulder and said something she half understood, that some paths must separate so others can survive. But as the sun climbed and the valley stretched before her one last time, she knew she would not survive this parting. Somewhere beyond those mountains, the man she had promised herself to was waiting, the one who believed she was still his. But her heart no longer beat for that world. It belonged to the wild silence, to the wind, to the man who had risked everything for her. And though she walked away, she could still feel him watching from the cliffs. Unseen but near, a ghost of love that would not fade with distance. The land was changing. The war was coming. And she carried both their hearts into the unknown, caught between two worlds that could never meet without breaking her completely. The trail rose in a line of red switchbacks. Cutting across the ribs of the mountains, she climbed with the small group at dawn, led by two scouts and the elder woman who kept close to her side. The pack horses snorted white breaths in the chill. The camp had sent them out in silence, as if the morning itself knew not to speak. Behind them, smoke from cook fires thinned into the pale sky. She did not look back. She feared that if she did, her feet would turn around and carry her to the cliffs where he might be watching. By mid-morning, they reached a saddle where wind combed the grass flat, and the world opened in every direction. To the east spread a hard, bright plain. To the west lay a chain of blue ridges that looked like the backs of sleeping animals. The elder touched her arm and pointed toward the north. There, tucked into the folds of rock, a narrow valley cut away from the main pass. A safe path, the elder said, in a mix of words and gestures. Hunters used it when storms crowded the higher trail. It would hide them from riders coming from the settlement. They started down the side path. Loose stones rolled underfoot. She kept her head low, yet her thoughts ran ahead to the man who had stayed behind, and to the other life waiting somewhere near the river towns. The promise stood in her mind like a fence post set deep in clay. She could not pull it free, yet it no longer marked the border it once had. The wind brought the scent of pine and damp earth, and with it came the memory of his hand closing around hers in the river, steady and warm. Near noon, the scouts halted. The younger one knelt and pressed his ear to the ground. He pointed at a patch of dust and held up 2 fingers. Horses, not far. The elder drew them off the trail into a stand of juniper. They waited without a word. The click of beetles sounded loud. She counted breaths to keep from shaking. At last, the riders passed on the main trail above them. 4 men in hats pulled low. She caught a flash of a blue coat. Soldiers or men who liked to be taken for soldiers. Her throat went dry. When the riders were gone, they moved again, slower and lower under the trees. The elder glanced at her from time to time with a look that was not unkind, only heavy with the strain of keeping a secret alive. By evening, they reached a narrow basin that held a green spring and a circle of cottonwoods. They made a small fire that gave more smoke than flame. The elder set a pot to heat, then cut willow sticks into thin strips and soaked them. Her fingers were quick and sure. She worked a weave that would become a small basket by morning, something for the girl to carry at the next day's start. It felt like a gift and a lesson at once. Under the trees she tried to sleep, but the night made room for worries to lie down beside her. She wondered what the riders had seen, wondered if the warrior had met them along some bend in the canyon. She told herself he was clever and quiet, the kind of man the land itself might help. Still, her hands would not grow warm. By the second day, the path tightened into a slot where walls rose straight as church pillars. The scouts moved like shadows, pausing to study faint signs on the ground. Now and then, the elder touched the girl's sleeve and whispered a warning about loose rock or a thorn hidden in the brush. Near afternoon, they came upon the remains of a camp tucked under an overhang, a black ring of ash, an old horseshoe bent out of shape, a coil of wire. The elder crouched to study it, then looked toward the sky with a troubled brow. The wire meant ranchers had been here. Fences were coming even into places stone had once kept to itself. That night, a thin moon hung low over the basin. Coyotes called back and forth until the world felt stitched together by sound. She sat awake and turned her promise over like a coin. She had given it young, when words seem as sturdy as long nails. The man from her town had been kind in the way men are when they believe a life will always keep its line. He had offered safety in a house with a porch that faced the river. He had talked about a pair of fine horses and a room with space for a cradle in case God gave them luck. She had nodded and smiled and set her hand in his, and the church bell had made everything sound right and strong. Then the raid came. She still did not know its cause. Some said a string of cattle had been cut loose. Others blamed men who used the desert as a game and called their hunting a sport. The truth was likely a chain with many links. She remembered smoke and shouting, remembered the way fear makes the mind slow and bright at the same time. She remembered the warrior's arms lifting her and the scent of rain in the dust when he gave her water. That part of the story felt clean, even when every other piece felt torn. On the third morning, they met 2 hunters from the camp who had tracked them by a longer route. One was a cousin of the warrior. He carried a bundle of dried meat and news as lean as the meat itself. The riders from the settlement had taken the South Pass. A patrol from the fort had moved toward the river. The elders planned to scatter the main camp into smaller groups and travel by hidden wash. He looked at the girl with a distance in his eyes, then at the elder, then back at the ground. After a while, he said the warrior had not slept in 2 nights. They rested by the spring, and she watched the cousin mend a broken arrow with sinew and patience. He had the same calm the warrior carried, though not the same shadow in his gaze. She asked about the name the camp used when they spoke of the man who had saved her. The cousin told her its meaning in slow English. It was a word that held wind and stone both. It was not a name meant to be said lightly. She tried to shape it with care, and when she did, the cousin looked up and gave a short nod, as if she had placed a foot right on a dangerous path. That afternoon, the elder sent the cousin ahead to check the ridge country. The younger scout stayed behind with them and showed the girl how to set a snare in the brush. She watched and copied, clumsy but willing. He said little. When she finally managed a knot that would not slip, he allowed the corner of his mouth to lift for one breath. It felt like a small light in a dim room. They reached the mouth of the valley by sunset. From there, the world fell away in a series of broken shelves and high mesas. The elder pointed to a thin line of cottonwoods that marked a dry creek. The safe place lay along that line, where an old camp sat under a wall of red rock. The younger scout went on ahead to light a small signal fire, if the way was clear. The girl and the elder waited with the horses in the shadow of a boulder shaped like a sleeping bull. As they waited, the elder began to speak more freely. She did not tell stories in a grand way. She set them out like stones, one by one. There had been a time when her people moved with the seasons and counted their wealth by horses and songs. Then the soldiers built roads and posts and gates. Then ranchers strung wire and set marks on the land. Then traders arrived with barrels of bad liquor and crates of cheap goods that looked rich until they broke. Each stone lay hard beside the next. None could be moved without moving all. The elder did not say this to shape the girl's mind. She spoke as if she were laying a map where even grief could be read. They started again when the first star came out. The younger scout had left a mark of ash on a rock, which meant the path was safe. The wind picked up and combed the grass in long strokes. She pulled her shawl close and tried to keep her thoughts from circling the same trail. The safe place could not be far now. She would stay there until the trading season. Then a wagon could take her down from the ridge to the river road. From there she would be carried back to the life she had almost lost. That was the plan. It sounded tidy when said in a line like that. Near midnight, they entered the old camp. It was little more than a sweep of level ground tucked under an overhang that had been blackened by 1,000 fires. The air smelled of mineral and old smoke. The elder spread blankets and told the girl to sleep. The younger scout took the first watch and sat with his back to the stone, eyes on the entrance, where the dark pressed close. Sleep came in pieces. She dreamed of water rushing in a narrow channel, of hands reaching but never touching, of a horse running without sound. She woke to the whisper of voices. The younger scout had risen to meet a shape at the mouth of the camp. The shape stepped forward into the thin light and became the warrior. She sat up so fast, the blanket slid from her shoulders. He was thinner than he had been, as if the week had stripped him down to bone and will. Dust had turned his braids pale at the edges. His eyes found hers and stayed there. No one spoke for a long breath. The elder stood and the younger scout stood, and the camp felt suddenly small for the weight of feeling inside it. At last the warrior asked if any riders had been seen. The younger scout answered, no. The elder asked about the main camp. He said the people had moved along the wash as planned and had not been followed. He hesitated, then touched his arm. The cousin had gone missing during the night. He had left tracks that led toward a dry canyon. There had been signs of a struggle and boot prints where no Apache would walk. The warrior looked again at the girl as if to measure how much truth her face could hold. The elder spoke with him in their own language, quick and low. The words went back and forth, like sticks tapped together. The warrior argued. The elder shook her head. He argued again. Finally, she lifted her hand in a way that ended the talk without anger. Then she turned to the girl and said the warrior would stay until morning, then go to search for his cousin. The girl would remain in the old camp for 2 days. If the warrior did not return by then, the scout would lead her to a trading post where she might find passage. The plan sounded like a thin bridge over a deep cut in the land. They ate in a quiet line. The warrior sat near the entrance with his bow across his knees. The girl brought him water. When their hands brushed, both drew back as if the touch had burned. She wanted to ask him everything at once. How close the riders had come. Whether his people blamed him for her. What he had seen in the sky the day he left her near the fire and walked into the storm. Words crowded her mouth and then fell away. Instead, she said only that she had tried to be brave. He gave a short nod. The nod meant many things. It meant he had seen the tracks of her bravery on the ground she had walked. Before dawn, he stood and tightened the straps on his pack. The sky wore a thin gray edge. He touched the elder's shoulder in respect, spoke to the scout and gave directions with hand signs. When he turned to the girl, something inside her stepped forward of its own will. She reached out and took his hand. The world narrowed to that hold. He did not pull away. He leaned closer so his words would not carry on the stone. You carry my thoughts when I leave, he said in slow English. The land will keep you if you listen. He paused, then added that the men who hunted were not all the same. Some were paid by ranchers to keep fence lines quiet. Others rode for the fort and liked the sound their boots made on wood floors. One of them had the kind of patience that comes from a long hate. He had seen that kind before. He told her not to speak to any white riders until she knew which kind they were. Her heart beat hard against her ribs because she knew that one of those riders might be the man she had once planned to marry. He left as the first birds began to call from the cottonwoods. His figure went small against the pale east. She watched until the line of the land swallowed him. The elder told her to rest, then sleep a little more. The scout took a slow walk around the camp and set small stones where he wanted to notice changes later. Morning built itself out of small sounds and the smell of ash and damp earth. By noon the sun burned hot again. The girl helped the elder gather wood, careful to step on stone more than dirt. She braided her hair tight and tied it with a strip of cloth the elder had dyed with berries. The elder's hands did not slow, even when her eyes went far away. She was thinking of the missing cousin. The scout brought back tracks of a deer and no sign of men. The spring at the edge of the camp ran as a thin trickle. She knelt to cup it with her hands and almost saw her face in the water before ripples blurred it again. That evening the sky grew strange. A hard line of cloud rose from the west. The elder studied it and said the wind there was not right. The scout said he would climb to the ridge at dark and listen. The girl stayed by the fire and watched shadows crawl along the rock like long animals. When the scout returned, his mouth was a flat line. He had heard a metal sound not made by nature. It had the shape of spurs and a link of chain and the click of a hammer drawn back. The riders had turned toward the old camp. They put out the fire and packed what they could carry in a rush that made no noise. The elder spoke to the scout in the fast way, then took the girl by the hand and guided her into a shallow cave cut high in the overhang. "You will stay here until I call," she whispered, "no matter what sound you hear." She placed a small knife in the girl's palm and curled her fingers around it as if to teach them how to hold on. Then she climbed down like a much younger woman and vanished into the dark. The girl lay flat and pressed her cheek to the cool stone. The cave smelled of old ash and lichen. Beyond her feet, a black crack led deeper into the rock, narrow and inviting in the way hiding places always are. She listened until the world became only the shape of listening. A horse stamped, a man coughed. Another voice told him to hush. She fought the urge to lift her head. Boots scraped on stone. Someone laughed in a way that did not suit the place. Men moved into the old camp and began to search. She caught a word from the fort, another from the river town where she had once lived. A third man said a name she knew as well as her own, the man who had believed she belonged to him. The name did not sound like home the way it once had. It sounded like a chain. The men talked about a bounty set by ranchers who wanted the pass made safe for fence posts. They talked about a preacher who had told his congregation that God marked some folks for rule and some for being ruled, and how that made hard work feel like right work. They talked about the girl who had vanished in the raid and about how a reward stood for any man who brought her back. The voices shifted with greed, and greed did not care whose blood it shook loose. A hand brushed the ledge under the cave where she hid. Dust rose and tickled her nose. She held her breath until her lungs burned. A man's fingers hooked the edge as if to pull himself up. The knife in her hand grew slick. Body felt made of one drumbeat. Then a call came from near the spring, and the hand dropped back to the ground. The men moved toward the sound. She heard a gasp that could only be the elder's, and another sound that might have been a blow. She almost slid from the cave then, but the elder's last instruction held her like a rope. Night settled, heavy as a blanket, wet from the river. The men stayed, drank from a skin and set a guard and stretched out near the wall. Now and then a match flared and died. The girl lay awake and traced the lines of the story she was caught inside. On one side stood her promise, made in a world that had never asked her to choose between heart and safety. On the other side stood the man who had taught her a new kind of quiet. Between them lay riders who would take what they could and call it law. She waited for the sound of a step she knew from far away. She waited for the sky to find a lighter color at the edge. She waited for the next turn of the war she had not wanted yet had walked into with both eyes open. And as the wind turned cold and brought the smell of rain again, she understood that the land was not done with her. It had only just started its work. Wind tore through the narrow canyon, carrying the smell of gunpowder and fear. She pressed herself against the cold stone, her breath shallow as she listened to the riders below. Their voices echoed up through the rocks, coarse and confident, the kind of sound made by men who believed they owned the land they stood on. She could see the flicker of their torches through the cracks. a trembling light that made her heartbeat pound in her ears. The elder's warning circled in her mind. No matter what you hear, do not come out. But when one of the men shouted her name, something in her broke. That voice didn't belong to a stranger. It was the man from her old life, the one she had been promised to. The one who had once spoken her name as though it was the safest word he knew. Now that same name came from his lips, sharp as a command. "Come down," he shouted. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." His words might have fooled someone else, but she heard what lay beneath them: fear, anger, and something darker. He wasn't there to save her. He was there to reclaim what he believed was his. The men moved closer, their boots grinding against the gravel. She held her breath, praying they wouldn't find the narrow crack that led up to her hiding place. A coyote cried out in the distance, and one of the men cursed under his breath. The fire below flared for a moment, lighting their faces. The man she once knew was older now, his jaw rough with stubble, his eyes colder than she remembered. He carried his rifle carelessly, the way someone does when he expects no danger. Down near the spring, the elder's shadow shifted. The girl's stomach twisted as she saw one of the men strike her, a hard and patient blow that made the elder stumble but not fall. The old woman said something in her language, quiet but steady, and the men laughed. The girl's hand tightened around the knife the elder had given her. Every instinct screamed to move, but she stayed frozen. The wind carried their laughter up the canyon, mingling with the restless hiss of the grass. She knew if she ran, they'd see her. If she stayed, they might find her anyway. Then a sound broke through the night, faint, distant, but clear. A whistle. 3 short notes, 1 long. She recognized it at once. It was him, the Apache warrior. Her heart leapt to her throat. The men below didn't notice at first. They were arguing now, their words tangled in liquor and pride. But the elder lifted her head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the cliffs. She had heard it too. The girl crawled backward through the narrow passage, scraping her hands on the rock. Every move was slow, deliberate, her ears tuned to the voices below. When she reached the far side of the ledge, the world opened into a small drop leading to a flat ridge. She hesitated only for a second before climbing down, her feet finding holds by instinct. When she reached the ridge, he was already there, shadowed against the faint glow of dawn, his hair pulled back, his bow slung over his shoulder. For a moment she forgot the fear. It looked as though he had been carved from the land itself. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stepped closer. "I said I would find you." "They have her," she said quickly. "The elder." They hit her. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Steady motioned for her to stay low. Together they moved along the ridge, following the curve of the canyon until they could see the men more clearly. 3 of them were awake, sitting near the fire. The one she had once promised herself to was pacing, his rifle slung across his shoulder. The elder sat bound beside the spring, her chin lifted despite the bruise on her cheek. "They're waiting for daylight," the Apache murmured.
Oh.
"They'll move when they can see tracks." She turned to him. "They think I'm still there." He nodded. "That will buy us time." The tension between them was sharp, but beneath it ran something deeper, the pull of everything they hadn't said. She wanted to tell him she was sorry for leaving, that she hadn't wanted to go, but there wasn't time for words, not now. They waited in silence as the sky began to pale. The Apache studied the men below with calm, watchful eyes. Then he leaned close to her and spoke softly. "There's a narrow pass behind this ridge. It leads to the mesa. You can go there and stay hidden until—" "No," she cut in. "I'm not leaving her." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "They see you, they'll take you. They'll kill her if we do nothing." For a long moment neither spoke. The air between them felt heavy with everything that could be lost. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Then we move at dawn." The plan was simple, dangerous, and desperate. He would draw their attention away, while she slipped down to cut the elder's ropes. If all went well, they could disappear into the maze of canyons before the men realized what had happened. If it failed, she didn't let herself finish the thought. The light crept across the rocks, painting the world in muted gold. The Apache rose, his movements quiet as breath. He looked at her once, eyes steady. "Stay low," he said. Then he was gone, a shadow melting into the rocks. She watched as he circled wide, vanishing behind a cluster of boulders. For a long moment, the canyon was still. Then came the sharp twang of a bowstring and the cry of a startled horse. The men leapt to their feet, shouting. Another arrow flew, striking the ground near the fire. The man she once knew barked orders, his voice hoarse with anger. Heart-pounding, she climbed down the slope, keeping to the shadows. The elder saw her coming and gave the smallest nod. The ropes were tied tight, the fibers rough against her fingers. Her hands shook as she worked. "Quiet," the elder whispered. "One man stays." The girl froze. She turned slightly and saw him, the fourth rider, the one who had stayed behind. He was younger than the others, with a thin scar running along his cheek. He was watching the chaos, rifle in hand, his eyes darting from the ridge to the spring. The last knot came loose. The elder's hands were free. "Go," the girl whispered. But before they could move, the young man turned. His eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat the world stopped. He lifted his gun. The sound that followed was deafening. Not one shot, but two. The girl stumbled backward, the world spinning. She saw the man drop to the ground, an arrow buried deep in his chest. The Apache was there, moving fast, his bow already drawn again. "Run," he shouted. The elder grabbed her arm and they fled toward the rocks. Bullets tore through the air, snapping against stone. Dust filled her lungs as they ran. The Apache moved ahead of them, drawing fire away. His every motion was precise, a rhythm of survival. They reached the edge of the canyon, where the ground dropped sharply into a dry riverbed. The elder hesitated. "Too steep," she warned. He turned to them. "Jump." The girl looked down. It wasn't far, but far enough to break a leg if she fell wrong. Behind them came the shouts of the men. Closer now. Without thinking, she took the elder's hand and leaped. The fall knocked the air from her chest. She landed hard, pain flaring up her side, but she was alive. The Apache landed beside them, grabbed her hand, and pulled her to her feet. "This way," he said. They ran through the dry riverbed, the walls high on either side. Above, voices echoed as the men followed their trail. The elder stumbled once and he caught her before she fell. The girl could hear the sound of horses again they had mounted, closing the distance. The path ahead split into two. The Apache paused, glancing between them. One led deeper into the canyon, the other wound upward, toward the mesa. He looked back at her. "You choose?" Her mind spun. Both paths looked dangerous, both uncertain, but the mesa offered height, a view, a chance. "Up," she said. He nodded, and they climbed. The slope was steep, the rock loose. Every muscle burned. Every breath felt like fire. She could hear the men below now, their voices rising. One shouted her name again, that same voice from her past, sharp with fury. When they reached the top, the land opened into a wide stretch of red stone. The wind tore at her hair. For a brief, dizzying moment, she could see everything, the endless plains to the east, the dark thread of forest beyond, and behind them, the narrow canyon crawling with riders. The Apache turned to her. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his chest rising and falling. "They won't stop," he said. "They'll follow until one side breaks." She met his gaze. "Then we can't break." Below them, the riders began to climb. The sound of hooves and voices carried on the wind. The elder loaded a small pistol she had hidden beneath her shawl. The Apache strung another arrow, his movements calm. The girl crouched beside him, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The sun burned low, turning the world to gold and blood. The riders came closer. She could see their faces now, her old life chasing her through the dust. The Apache looked at her once, eyes full of something fierce and final. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "you run when I tell you." She shook her head. "Won't leave you." He didn't argue. The wind caught his hair. The sound of thunder rolled somewhere far away, and in that suspended breath between light and dark. Everything in the world hung waiting. The promise, the love, the war, and the choice she could no longer escape. Then, from below, the first shot rang out. The shot cracked across the mesa, echoing through the canyons like thunder against stone. Dust lifted from the earth, and the girl dropped low behind a rock. Her heart beat so hard she thought it would tear through her chest. The Apache was already moving, swift, silent, bow in hand. The men below shouted, their rifles flaring in short, angry bursts. The smell of gunpowder rolled up with the wind, sharp and bitter. She crawled to where the elder crouched, pressing her back to the stone. "Stay down," the girl whispered. The elder nodded, her eyes fierce and unshaken despite the danger. Another bullet struck the rock near them, spraying shards that burned her cheek. She didn't cry out. The Apache returned fire with arrows that flew sure and fast, each one carrying the quiet wrath of the land itself. The riders fanned out, trying to flank them. One broke off from the group and began to climb the slope on their left. The girl saw him and froze. It was the man from her old world, the one she had promised herself to. His blue coat was torn at the shoulder, his face hard, sunburned and angry. He shouted her name again, his voice cracking with something between fury and desperation. "Come with me now," he yelled, "before it's too late." His words sounded strange, too loud in a place that belonged to silence. She wanted to believe he still meant safety, but there was no safety in his eyes, only pride and possession. The Apache appeared from behind a cluster of rocks, drawing his bow. "Stay back," he warned, his voice calm, low. The man laughed bitterly. "You think she belongs here? You think she's one of you?" He raised his rifle. "She's mine." For a moment, time hung still. The girl stood between them, torn by the weight of two worlds. The man she had promised, and the one who had taught her what it meant to live. "Stop!" she cried. "No more." But neither moved. The wind shifted, carrying dust and tension. The Apache's bow creaked as he pulled the string tight. The other man's finger trembled on the trigger. And then a shot rang out again. The rifle fired first, shattering the silence. She screamed, thinking the Apache had fallen. But when the smoke cleared, it was the man in the blue coat who dropped to his knees, eyes wide with disbelief. The weapon slipped from his hand, clattering against stone. He looked up at her once, confusion softening his anger. "I came to bring you home," he said weakly, then fell forward. The Apache stood still, bow lowered, his face pale under the dust. He hadn't loosed his arrow. The shot had come from somewhere else. The elder, who now stood with her small pistol still raised, her hand steady despite her years. She said nothing, only looked at the girl with eyes that carried both sorrow and understanding. The remaining riders hesitated, glancing at their fallen leader. Without his voice, their will seemed to falter. One cursed under his breath, another pulled his rein sharply, and before long they were retreating, leaving dust, death, and silence behind. When it was over, the wind settled. The land felt different, quieter, heavier. The girl knelt beside the man who had once been her future. His blood stained the red dirt, soaking into the desert like rain into dry ground. He had fought for what he believed was right, but he had never understood that hearts cannot be owned. She closed his eyes with trembling fingers, whispering a prayer for a peace he never found in life. The Apache approached slowly, his face unreadable. He looked down at the body, then at her. "He was part of your world," he said softly. She nodded. "You are part of mine now." He did not answer right away. The elder stepped forward, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Two rivers cannot run separate forever," she said. "They meet somewhere in the land, even if the water carries different names." They buried him at the edge of the mesa, where the earth broke open to the horizon. The sun fell low as they worked, painting the world in a quiet gold. The girl's hands ached from the effort, but she didn't stop until the ground was smooth again. The elder spoke words in her language, low, rhythmic, carried by the wind. When it was done, the three of them stood in silence, watching the sun sink beyond the hills. That night, the fire burned low. The air was cool and dry, scented with pine. The Apache sat across from her, sharpening his knife by the light of the flames. His eyes flicked up to hers, and in them she saw the question he didn't speak. "What now?" "I can't go back," she said quietly. "Even if the others think I should." He nodded. "You don't have to, but your people," she whispered. "They'll never accept me. They don't need to," he said simply. "The land does." The fire cracked softly. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. She looked up at the stars, remembering how small and sure her world had once been. Now it stretched wider than she had ever dreamed, vast, wild, full of pain and beauty. She had lost a promise, but gained something truer. Days later, when the dust had settled and the threat had faded, the Apache led her and the elder back to the main camp. The people greeted them with cautious eyes. Some whispered, some turned away. But the children came first, running toward her unafraid. One girl pressed a wildflower into her hand. That small kindness broke something open in her heart. The elders spoke to the gathered tribe, telling them what had happened on the mesa. Her voice carried calm and strength, and by the end, no one argued. The Apache stood beside her, but said little. His silence spoke for him. That night they built a new fire, one of peace instead of fear. The drums were soft, not for celebration, but for remembrance. The girl sat near the flames, feeling the rhythm pulse through the earth beneath her. The Apache joined her, his arm brushing hers. No words were needed. Seasons passed. The scars of that day slowly faded, though some remained deeper than the skin. The settlers pushed further west, and the world began to change again. Fences where there had been open fields, roads where there had been trails. Yet in that hidden valley, time still moved slower. The girl learned the language of the people who had once been strangers to her. She learned to ride without a saddle, to listen to the sky, to see stories written in the stars. The Apache taught her the names of the hills, the rivers, the winds that carried scent and sound across miles. In return, she told him stories of the world she left behind, of church bells and wheat fields, of a town that no longer felt like home. Sometimes she still thought of the man buried beneath the mesa, and when she did, it wasn't with anger. She had come to understand that promises, like people, were born of the times they're made. His world had been built on rules that couldn't survive the wildness of this one. Her heart had simply outgrown the walls built for it. Years later, travelers passing through the desert spoke of a woman with red hair who lived among the Apache, a woman who moved like one of them but spoke with a voice that carried the rhythm of another world. They said she could calm horses with a touch, and that her songs at night made the canyons echo. Some stories said she had once been taken captive. Others said she had chosen to stay. But the truth lived somewhere between, not in chains or vows, but in the freedom of a heart that had found where it belonged. And when the wind rose across the land, it carried two names together, one from the past. One from the wild, blending like rivers meeting in the valley, bound not by promise, but by love that had defied both worlds. The desert kept their story, written in dust and rain, waiting for anyone willing to listen.